Can you see that?
Yep, that's perfect.
Yes. Perfect. All right, brilliant. Thank you. Sorry about that. So let me just start, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this very quick introduction today. It's really exciting to see the first In Conversation event happening. So my name's Suzanne Sargent. I am one of the co-chairs of the UKADR Steering Committee. And for those of you who perhaps haven't encountered UKADR before, we're the UK Alliance for Disaster Research. And UKADR is an alliance of UK-based researchers. Our aim is to facilitate collaboration and partnership. And just to say that when we talk about UK-based, we are including the UK overseas territories here. For the UK government, research funders and practical actors, UKADR is an advocate for UK science. It's a contact point if they're seeking the best UK science input, and a mechanism to communicate their needs to us, us being the UK disaster research community. UKADR also provides a platform to interface with international initiatives, and by this we mean UNDRR, but also initiatives like GADRI, so that's the Global Alliance for Disaster Research Initiatives. I think this really speaks to the point for to the need for cooperation, collaboration, and networking, good relationships between all researchers working in this area. UKADR is also about, it says strengthening science here, and absolutely that's true, but it's also about supporting the research community and providing spaces for us to get together, to discuss issues that are of common interest, to have events like this, and to really build those relationships. There's a huge amount of information about UKADR on the website here, and I would encourage you to go to that. Now, on the next slide, I'll just tell you a bit about who UKADR is. So at the moment, we've got about 400 members, and then, so that's individual members based in research institutes across the UK. We have 27 core partners, and these are research institutes in universities and other sectors who've, again, active in disaster research. We've got 4 endorsing partners, and these are aligned organisations that share UKADR's views but aren't collaborating partners, if you like. 1 steering committee made up of members of UKADR that are elected onto the steering committee for a period of time. 2 co-chairs, partridge in a pear tree. That's me and Amy Donovan at Cambridge University. So we're currently looking after the running of the steering committee, and 1 advisory board, which includes, I believe David actually is a member of the advisory board now. So we have this network, if you like, supporting the activities of UKADR. It's really important to recognise that UKADR is completely independent. It's not owned by anyone, and it's really just of the research community. Members come from a wide range of disciplines and sectors, from natural sciences all the way across to law, with everything in between. It's only supported by voluntary contributions from member organisations. That might be in terms of time for the steering committee, or for it might be in terms of providing spaces for the events that UKADR organises, face-to-face particularly. Membership is open to employees and research students from any UK-based organisation, including the UKOTs, who are engaged in research or capacity building for DRR or disaster risk management anywhere in the world. And if you're interested in becoming a member, if you aren't already, membership is free, I should say, you can download a form from this website address here. So one of the things that, as I was mentioning, UKADR really provides a space for researchers to come together, and so that we can share ideas and knowledge and think about how we can make our science more impactful and relevant. One way we do this is through the annual conference, and the next one will be on the 18th and 19th of December in Huddersfield. It's being hosted by the University of Huddersfield. And the theme is 2030 and beyond, looking at risk-informed decision-making, investment and behaviour. it would be fantastic to see you all there. You can, if you go to the UKADR website, you can find a link to the conference and everything you need is there. And I think that's everything. So that's all from me. I will stop sharing now. There we go. So please say if you've got any questions, but if not, then I'm really happy to hand the floor over to David and Ava and Ashley. I'm really excited to hear what David's going to be telling us about today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna, for a really informative introduction to UKADR. Okay, so we're now going to move into the interview stage of today's discussion. And I have 6 broad questions. But David, first of all, could you, briefly describe your involvement in the field of disasters? You're muted.
There we go. I'm delighted to do that, but before I do so, let me just say a word about where I am. I wondered whether you were going to ask me, when did you last have a disaster? And I was about to say, well, about 10 days ago, we had big floods on the coast. However, I'm speaking to you from a place called San Casciano in Val di Pesa, which is 17 kilometers due south of the center of the city of Florence. And this morning, here in Tuscany, we have 5 dead and 1 missing, vast areas underwater, unprecedented winds, a flood wave that passed through Florence about an hour ago, fortunately without inundating it, 40,000 subscribers without electricity, landslides everywhere, a hospital underwater, and a variety of different cities and towns flooded, people rescued from a flooded train, and roads and motorways underwater, bridges washed away. Just another autumn day, really. The president of the region has declared a state of emergency, and the president of the province of Prato has asked for the declaration of a state of disaster. So here we are right in the middle of it. One reason for telling you this is, apart from the immediacy of it, if the electricity goes off, I fear that's it. Well, for the last hour or so, it's been fairly stable, although earlier this morning it was in a bit of a state coming and going. Nevertheless, we hope for the best, and we hope the worst is now over. My involvement in the field of disasters, well, I decided I wouldn't give you a PowerPoint. For once in my life, I wouldn't subject you to death by PowerPoint. But if you absolutely want one, if you look for me on SlideShare, there are more than 130 of my PowerPoints there, and they're all downloadable. They're actually pretty repetitive, but there they are anyway. It all started at 7:34 and 52.8 seconds on Sunday, the 23rd of November, almost the anniversary now, 1980. How can I be so precise? Well, thanks to instrumental seismology. That was the start of an earthquake in southern Italy that killed 3,000 people and injured 9,000. I was right there close to the epicenter. It took the roof off the house I was renting. And well, on the positive side, it provided 10 years of study opportunities. But that was really the start of it. And the catalyst, if anything, was a draft of a document by the Pan American Health Organization on health facilities in disaster, later published, but it was circulating in the disaster area. And I looked at it and I realized suddenly that there, in fact, is some kind of method in all of this. In other words, there's something to study that isn't random. And let's remember how things were in those days. There was one journal, which was Disasters, that had been founded in 1976. If you said you were a student of disasters, people laughed at you, or they made funny signs and stepped away from you and all of that. It became a social leper or something. How things have changed. We now have tens of thousands of people involved in this, and well, they might be the way things are going. But really what we wanted to do in those pioneer days was to provide the knowledge that people need to monitor disasters better, to manage them better, to respond better, to recover better, to mitigate better, all of that. And we're still doing that. And the problem, if anything, is getting harder and worse as life gets more complicated. It's worth noting that when I was born, the population of the world was 2.61 billion. Well, look at it now, more than 3 times greater. That alone is something to ponder when it comes to all of this. We also have a rather different way of looking at things. We have rather different hazards in some cases, and we have greatly intensified hazards in others. It reminds me that last summer we had long periods of drought. This was 2002, actually. We had long periods of drought. It's a good example of you could walk down the country's major rivers without getting your feet wet. The crops were withering in the fields or burning in wildfires. We had those every day. Eventually, finally, we could stand it no more. It all ended. 3 days later, what did we get? Floods, tornadoes, landslides, the lot. It took a mere 3 days to do that switch. So I turn on the television at night and look at the news, and it seems that there's some kind of disaster every day. We also have to match that with the problems of conflict and warfare that are going on. So really, well, business is booming, unfortunately, even though our sole objective was to stop that happening. But so it is.
Yeah, and I remember Italy last year, in particular, how bad it was. And then suddenly, next thing I knew, it was the floods in Emilia-Romagna back in, was it May this year?
That was May, yes. Yeah.
So I remember that sudden switch myself, and I was surprised how quick it was going from one extreme to the next. So when I was thinking about this and I was reading your abstract, one of the questions that came out is, do you think the theory and the practice of disasters are now outdated? And, what changes do you believe are necessary, and what should we be focusing on going forward?
Absolutely. This is actually one of my pet things. We are still using theory that was current in the 1960s and perhaps also the 1970s in a world that has changed out of all recognition in many respects. In some it hasn't changed, but in others it has changed very, very radically. And we've really got to do something about that. Theory is our roadmap. It shines, if you don't mind me mixing my metaphors, it shines the light, the spotlight on problems, and it helps us find our way through them, because disasters may be unique, but they're not so unique that we don't have very strong connections between very many of them. And we get about 2 disasters a day around the world. But the kind of theory that we have is very much still in use. For example, in 1983, Kenneth Hewitt and his colleagues, after about 4 years of work, put out their book, Interpretations of Calamity, that said in no uncertain terms, vulnerability is the core of disasters. Now, 2 publications came out in recent months in the UK. One of those was the National Risk Register, latest version, 2023. And in the preceding December, out came the Resilience Framework. And if you look at those 2 documents, they have nothing to say about gender, about women, about minorities, abilities. Therefore, they have nothing much to say about vulnerability. After all, if we're going to tackle vulnerability, we need to look at who is vulnerable, how they're vulnerable, and why. And these documents don't do that. You can compare them with an internal study recently completed by the Red Cross, the British Red Cross. And that was all about vulnerability, because they want to know where to target their efforts most and to receive the biggest bang for their buck in terms of who is most vulnerable when something happens. And that is exemplary to me. But to have ignored the last 40 years of work that shows us that vulnerability is at the core of things. Anyway, we often tend to use the so-called pressure and release model, PAR, sometimes known as the crunch model. I've never really liked it. I'm sorry, I'm friends with the authors of it, 3 of them at least. The other one has left the field. Very good friends with them too, and I do appreciate their work and the model, but I think we could do better. The essence of the pressure release model is that we've got root causes. Great, we really need to look at them. We've got dynamic pressures that bring us towards the point of crunch, and then we've got the factors that precipitate disaster. Fair enough. But the one thing that I think we need to look more closely at now is context. How would we define context? Well, it's something that doesn't directly influence or relate to what's going on in disaster. It is something, it's the wrapping around the edge, but it is actually vitally important. So what I've been musing about and meditating on, unfortunately without suitable answers, is how we fit context into this. We've got political context, we've got environmental, we've all sorts of context. Okay, you might say, well, that's dynamic pressures in the crunch model. Well, it is and it isn't. Some of it is, definitely. I'm not suggesting we abandon the idea of dynamic pressures, but we've got a lot of things around that. And what you've actually got with vulnerability is two kinds. You've got general vulnerability. People are vulnerable. Why are they vulnerable? Well, they're sick or they're poor or they're homeless or whatever. And then we've got specific vulnerability to floods or something, which sits within that. But we have to look at how general vulnerability affects specific vulnerability, because we cannot make people less vulnerable against floods if they're going to be vulnerable against everything else. It just won't work. So in COVID, for example, everything was heavily centered on Westminster. They didn't look very carefully. They didn't do a great deal about Bolton and Oldham in Lancashire. Now, those are the two places where vulnerability to COVID was concentrated the most. They're the poorest areas in the country. This is northwestern Greater Manchester. There's a huge occupancy rate in rooms and houses there and so on. There are a lot of people who work on the front line in delivery and nursing and so on who are very much at risk of the disease. And we got higher rates of COVID there than we got elsewhere. But did we, in fact, get a better response to COVID in these places than elsewhere? I'm not at all sure that we did, for example. So I think we need to adopt a new methodology. We need to develop a new methodology based upon a new basic theory behind all of this.
Yeah, and actually, as you were talking, it reminded me of the case in Japan when you were talking about preparing for one type of disaster and forgetting about others, and 1995 in Kobe when that region particularly focused on typhoons and then put heavy roofs which were great for typhoons, but then when an earthquake came, the roofs just all started collapsing on people. So what do you think is the greatest risk facing us in the 21st century? In terms of technology, environment, geopolitics, or political health, because it feels like it's, getting worse.
It is, I think, getting worse. And the message there is that we need a civil protection system in virtually all countries that is not just better and bigger than what we have now. It's an order of magnitude better and bigger. In summer 2022, we had 3,000 firefighters in the south of France fighting fires. Well, in the future, we're going to need 30,000, not 3,000, I'm afraid. To say which is the most serious pressing future disaster is very difficult, but it does underline the fact that we need foresight studies and we need to plug them right into policy, strategy, tactics, operations in this field. So the UK government has foresight in the Government Office for Science, and they do it quite well. They've come up with 17 flashcards, for example, of things that could blow up in our faces in the UK. Okay, the trouble is the government doesn't seem to be listening, and governments haven't been listening. It's the second foresight study. What happened to the first one that came out in 2014, and so on? So I think the things that we need to look at principally are unplanned mass migration, proliferating technological failure, intensifying natural hazards with climate change, that is greater frequency and magnitude, What else have we got? Well, emerging risks. Let's remember that influenza of the pandemic and non-seasonal kind has about a 40-year cycle. The next one may be, the next pandemic may be light or it may be heavy. This we cannot predict because it depends upon mutation, which therefore gives us the transmissibility and the lethality of the virus. And that is something completely out of control. But if it were anything like 1918 to 1920, then we really would see some fireworks. And there are, of course, other viruses and other diseases which have the capacity to be pandemics. Interestingly, by the way, let me tell you a couple of things about pandemics. I first heard the full scenario on the 12th of October 2008 at a conference. It was a Palestinian professor of epidemiology at Al-Quds University, West Bank, who stood up for 45 minutes and said, this is going to happen. And he preceded his comments by saying, I'm going to tell you something that you don't believe will happen and ask you to spend money you haven't got on procedures you don't think will be necessary. And lo and behold, every year I taught this. At one point, indeed, I went up to UCL school in Swiss Cottage and taught this to 12-year-olds who were doing a pandemics exercise. That was in March 2017. And one of the 12-year-olds said to me, you said it would take more than 6 months to make a vaccine. How could you be sure the virus didn't mutate in that time so the vaccine didn't work? At the time, I hadn't a clue what the answer was. Now, of course, now we all know. But what a thing for a 12-year-old to say, years before, 3 years before the pandemic actually happened. And when it did happen, there was absolute chaos. Yes, there were plans. No, there weren't the resources. There was the abyss between what plans there were, which were insufficient, and the resources, which were even more insufficient, and the organization, which was often completely lacking. So those are things we can be aware. You know, I don't believe in this field we have black swans. The black swan is extinct. Its ecological niche has been occupied by the red herring. For example, if you take the crash of jet airliners into a 110-story building in Manhattan in 2001, it wasn't the first time that a jet aircraft had crashed into a skyscraper in Manhattan. So just about everything has precedence, and the black swan idea, it may work in economics, which is a very separate sort of discipline, but in this field, it's intellectual laziness and nothing else, because there are signs, they may be very weak signs, but there are signs of just about anything that could happen. It's worth noting, for example, that in terms of space weather, where we get geomagnetic currents that could knock out communications, telecommunications, satellites, burn out electricity transformers, not the kind of things on a pole, but the ones the size of a large room that take a year to manufacture. Now, that's going by the Carrington event of 1859, but in the Greenland ice cap, they found evidence in 660 BC of a Carrington-type event that was 10 times larger. What that would do to modern technology is anybody's guess. We have no idea. 2012, we had a Carrington event and it missed the Earth narrowly. So that could be very awkward. You get a 50-meter vertical error in navigation systems, which if you happen to be landing at Heathrow, is not what you want to happen. So these are some of the things that could happen. I'm sure there are others, but really, one thing is that we need to be ready for intersectional events. There's the obvious intersection between conflict and other kinds of disaster, whether they be radiation release or earthquake or whatever. They're the intersection between various sorts of events. Remember, during COVID, we had 3 major earthquakes, Japan, Croatia, and Turkey and Greece. And they required very different ways of dealing with them with respect to the pandemic. Social distancing in earthquake response, practically you don't have. But we had a pandemic at the time. So we could get all sorts of interactions there. All disasters nowadays are cascading events, simply because we live in network societies. Virtually all societies are networked. Even if you're a yak herder in Nepal or something, you still are probably reliant on your mobile phone. So we're bound to find cascading consequences. We're therefore bound to find escalation points where the interaction of vulnerabilities causes things to get significantly worse. And these are things we can be ready for. We can produce plans. We can use formal scenario modeling. We don't have to use quantification, but providing we've got inputs, throughputs, outputs, transformations, so we do this as rigorously as possible and provide an envelope of outcomes, worst case, best case, what do you call it, the counterfactual analysis, upward or downward. It could have been better, it could have been worse. And test that out, stress test it, then we can get to grips with this. We can produce usable results and do something with them, but we have to invest in it. The penalty of not investing is a shed load of money that is spent on the consequences of not getting things under control.
Yeah, that's a bit, and I agree. Kind of, it's a bit like the Stern report back in 2008, where it said that for every pound you spend, you save about £12 later on, and literally the governments have still, you could argue, are still ignoring that type of advice even today, even though that was predicted years ago.
That's right. We really don't actually know how much money you do save by mitigating disasters. The only thing we're pretty sure of is that you do save money by doing this. One reason we don't really know that is because the curve is non-linear. It's very non-linear. It's hook-shaped. In other words, once you start spending money on an unmitigated risk, you get huge returns in damage saved. The more you spend, the lower the returns get. Which is why it's very hard to quantify. We spent so much and we saved so much. It also involves hypothetical situations where what would have happened if we hadn't spent that money, kind of thing, which is difficult to quantify. But it's still, if you can't produce a quantitative or monetary justification, that doesn't mean it's not a good thing to mitigate, of course. It is a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. And just talking about when you've been talking about, risks, you've been talking about Carrington-style events. Earlier you were talking about technological and, geopolitical. I've just been finishing reading Toby Ord's book, The Precipice, which was released about, actually right in the middle of the pandemic. And, he deals very much with existential risks, to humanity. Climate change, AI, nuclear weapons, pandemics. These were just some of them he was talking about. Do you believe academia and or civil society are becoming more fatalistic in their view of risk? And are there any potential sources of hope in addressing the risks of tomorrow?
Well, actually, I think we have a very wide range of opinions on this. I think it is a good idea to study existential risk, which is defined as the kind of events that could wipe us out, either wholly or partly. When I was the scientific advisor, or the specialist advisor to the House of Lords Committee on Risk Assessment and Risk Planning, I got them to invite Robert Harris to be interviewed. Robert Harris is a novelist. I just finished reading his book, The Second Sleep, which, having read it during COVID at the height of it, it gave me nightmares and has done ever since. It's a portrait of England in 800 years' time after the collapse of the technological civilization, which he put as occurring in about 2025. Okay, it's fantasy, but it made some really good points about all of this. One point was that perhaps an existential event wouldn't totally wipe out the human race, but it would set it back enormously if it did occur. It's worth studying this, and it's worth seeing if we have any remedies at all But for most of us, there's nothing we can do about this. What we need to study are things that are much more tractable, in other words, smaller. We need to be aware of existential risk. We need to try to stop what you might call runaway reactions from leading us into that sort of situation. I don't think there is any cause to be absolutely pessimistic at the moment. There would be if nuclear war breaks out. But for the time being, no. Yes, there is the possibility of a VEI 7 volcanic eruption, volcanic explosivity index number 7, which would produce the equivalent of a nuclear winter and devastate crops all over the world and so on. On the other hand, the probability of it is not very high. The chance it will happen in the lifetime of ourselves and many of our descendants is not very high. We can afford to concentrate on smaller eruptions and other things, and I think we can achieve much more by doing so. What we need to be is active in this, and we need to be pushing for better arrangements in all respects. Now, for years we've talked about moving from responding to preventing. Good idea, yes, fine. The trouble with it is that you can't stop responding. How many times does one hear a politician say, money is no object? They usually don't mean it, but they feel they have to say it when something big happens. And they're still saying it years later. And the fact is that when it happens, you have to spend money on putting things right. It would therefore be opportune that we produced a civil protection system that adequately for each country and for groups of countries and regions and everything else, and above all locally, did the following. It did three things. It responded effectively and efficiently to the emergency in the best possible way. It brought us closer back to reality. That means damage prevention, damage mitigation in the first instance, first order. And thirdly, it prepared the ground for recovery. Those really are the three things that are going to have to be done, and they're going to have to be done very well on a very large scale and very repeatedly. If they're not done, then we waste lives. My view on COVID in the UK, for example, is that £50 billion were wasted on initiatives that were never going to work. And anyone with any knowledge of those initiatives would have said at the time they weren't going to work. They were the wrong way of doing it. For example, a test and trace system that was utterly centralized when it could have been run much more cheaply at a local level. And that failed spectacularly for 37 billion. At the same time, bad decision making is supposed to have led to the deaths of about 30,000 people who might have been saved. I think that is probably true. I mean, I've been saying this for a while, and it came out last week in the inquiry. That meant that what we needed there was better decision making, which had to be based upon a better system and also a greater, better degree of governance. All of that is actually achievable, but it requires some adjustment of the political system, and it requires the election and the leadership of people who are able to lead sensibly.
Okay. When I was reading your biography, I noticed you said that you held the position of Vice President of the Institute of Civil Protection and Emergency Management. I think I know what you're going to say here, but do you believe that the role of civil protection is currently being, underestimated, and how much investment do you think is necessary for civil protection?
Yes, in this respect, ICPEM, the Institute of Civil Protection and Emergency Management, is a nice example. It started as the Institute of Civil Defence in 1937-38. It's therefore the oldest learned society in the world in this field. At one point in time, it had about 22,000 members. That was when civil defence was a big, big issue, not the least because bombs were raining down upon this country and others. It now has 250 members, and it's a different entity of things, but it is a very nice clubbable sort of thing. So I encourage you to join that. If you're a student, you can join it for free as well. Civil protection, which I would define as something that is done locally and aggregated to the national or international level, and is there to protect the citizen against a range of hazards and threats, is absolutely essential and becoming more so by the day. In this region, in the last few hours, there have been more than 1,000 sorties by the fire service. This region has the oldest volunteer tradition in the world. The Misericordia is a volunteer civil protection organisation that was founded in 1244. The headquarters are still in the same building. It didn't actually reach my town here until 1639, although there are antecedents in 1525. But it's rock solid, it's volunteer driven. I'm here in a small town of 17,000 inhabitants that's got 3 emergency operations centres and a very, very strong volunteer tradition, which is integrated into a system of response to emergencies. What we find in the last 3 major Italian earthquakes is that there were more emergency responders than population. Population of L'Aquila City, 68,800 in 2009, 94,000 emergency responders. Population of the area affected by the Amatrice earthquakes of 2016, about 4,000. Number of emergency responders present, 7,500. Now, you might say that's overkill, although in reality it wasn't really, given the complexity of the problems and the extent of the damage. But at least it shows that it is possible to weld all of this into a coherent system that will go on the attack when it is really needed. In Florence, outside my window here, they can put 1,000 people into the field in 10 minutes and 5,000 in 2 hours. And no doubt they did that in the last few hours. They're probably there working right now. Indeed, they absolutely certainly are. We need more of that. We need more training. We need standards. For 5 years, I was the director of emergency training for the region of Lombardy, which is big enough to be a separate country, 1,547 municipalities in 12 provinces. We did a survey. There are 960 civil protection training courses, mostly 1 day long. But what we then did was I wrote the standard, got it passed by the regional parliament, and we started applying it by inviting the people who do courses to submit their courses for regional approval, and they got the stamp of approval there. And we made sure that what was in the courses was what was needed. We also held courses for all municipal mayors. We managed to get about 1/3 of them into the classroom, which really wasn't bad going because that's more than 500. We held that in each province one by one. 4 hours, we told them, this is the system, these are your responsibilities, and this is what you might have to face. Of course, trouble with that is with elected mayors, you need to do it constantly because there's a turnover of them. But I think it was a very good initiative. The way we got them into the room was that we promised them a really rattlingly good lunch afterwards, and we provided it too. And that was the lure that got them into the classroom. Our great fear was that we were preaching to the converted, getting those who really cared about emergencies into the room rather than the ones who really didn't care. But that's life. We did our best.
Yeah. So just a final question before we turn it over to Q&A. Where do you see the field of disasters, moving forward? And, what would you, where would you like it to go?
Well, I think I have a fairly good handle on where it is going, at least in terms of research, because I founded and I edit the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. The current manuscript submission rate is 3,800 a year. So I've had periods in the last 2 weeks where I've been getting one new manuscript every 50 minutes. And to be honest, there's a lot of rubbish there. There is also now a very strong tendency to produce algorithms, which means that these are made by mathematicians who actually don't understand disasters at all. And that is very, very worrying. Now, I think actually the practitioner community would not use these algorithms. They wouldn't want to run the risk of relying on them. Many of them wouldn't work anyway. They're very good on paper, but they're absolutely useless when you think of the data you need to collect and the decisions you need to make in the field. But it is sad to see a waste of effort in this respect. We'll see what artificial intelligence has to add to that. I'm just hoping for the best, but I'm a bit pessimistic about it. We need to reintroduce and strengthen the human dimension of that. Where's it going to go? Well, I think it's visibly increasing in size as a field, academically and practically. And the pace is obviously being forced by disasters. It could hardly be otherwise. Roughly 3/4 of the legislation around the world on disasters follows the event, although that may actually be a misstatement because it is almost impossible for legislation not to follow the event. The question is it actually triggered by the event is a little harder to answer. But nevertheless, you can find very many instances where there's been a really bad phase and really bad disasters, and then you get the laws, which says we must do this, we must do that. The following system is established and so on. Every country needs a basic law, and it needs to be kept up to date, and it is to say how the system will work. And after that, we get the details. So I think in terms of how this is going, we wanted to make emergency planning and management a fully fledged profession. Progress in that is far too slow, far too slow. The fact is, it may be codified common sense, but in fact, it does require training to the level of what most professionals have to do if they're architects, engineers, or whatever. And we've got to get that together. We've got to start in the academic field by having required reading. We don't have a corpus of things you must have read. I put together my ideas on that on my blog site. That was about 5 or 6 years ago, but it's still there. It's still readable, findable on my blog site. It doesn't include any of my own work, by the way. I think we ought to be defining things you have to read. When I did this, I found 95% of the things were in some way downloadable as PDFs, even if they were 100 years old. But we've really got to get people educated on this, both as practitioners and academics. We've got to get more academic input, which has got to be more palatable to the users. We've got to do this at the local level. And we've got to understand the global currents and the global constraints that are acting on all of this. I fear the fact is that whereas what's going on the ground is about 70% geography, what's going on at higher levels is about 70% politics. If we rule out the politics in all of this, we've got problems. We have to understand the politics and we have to act upon the politics in order to improve emergency preparedness. There's a real imperative that we do.
Yeah, thank you, David, for answering my questions. I'm now going to hand over to Eva, who's going to do the Q&A section with our audience.
Hi, thank you very much, David. There's definitely a lot of food for thought and a lot of things for keep thinking and to process, I would say. So thank you very much for sharing all this very rich experience and all your knowledge on this. There are no questions in the Q&A, so I will encourage people in the room to raise their hands and also have an opportunity now to ask any questions that you might have and use this as an opportunity. I've seen a very quick reaction from Kailash. Can we unmute Kailash to please introduce yourself so we also know who we have here today? Is she unmuted or can she unmute?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear
yes,
me?
we can.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay. I'm Dr. Kailash Gupta. I'm from India, and I have been a full-time disaster management professional for last 22 years. Since there was a 26 January 2001 Gujarat earthquake in India, in which about 25,000 people died. That time I got my calling. Okay, so my my question is, I feel in India, you would, Alexander, you would be knowing, in India, so many disasters happen every day and so many people die. And I feel ashamed. To me, even a one person dying because of the disaster which is avoidable is a shameful act. And I feel really ashamed. So my question is, what we professionals, I mean, you said 70% politics and all those things, but in real life, in reality, what can really we do to make that change? And one last thing, you are also aware, and maybe other people are aware, about 95% of the global resources are spent post-disaster, not pre-disaster or preparedness or research. That's the question.
Yes, it is, I think, largely a political problem of how to get money spent on mitigation and preparedness. The situation you described reminds me of Indonesia, where they also seem to have a number of disasters every week. And I spoke to an Indonesian cabinet minister in Jakarta who said that disasters were top of the political agenda. I hope he meant it. I do hope he meant it. So they should be. We have the technical solutions to many things. We need, of course, to look and see where can we get the best value for money when we spend our money. Resources are always going to be scarce. Therefore, we need to concentrate our efforts where we get the best results for what we can spend and what we do spend. But there are examples. For example, if you look at Chile, it has done very well indeed regarding the safety of buildings against earthquakes. It has magnitude 8 earthquakes, and yet it has an excellent record for building safety. It's not a perfect record, but it is an excellent one. What it doesn't actually have is a very good organization of emergency preparedness and response. That is something that has lagged behind the engineering side of it. But the recognition of that would enable organizational changes to take place so that gradually comes up to the level of the engineering initiatives. If we look at Turkey, Turkey has had building codes since the 1930s, and the last major revision was done by 150 experts in 2018. It has had a decent enough national earthquake hazard map since 1967. I have a copy of that map. It therefore knew what to expect, where to expect it, and what to do in order to reduce earthquakes. We then find in February this year, we have mass collapse of multiple occupancy, multiple story, new or very young residential buildings, despite, well, I was able to download a dozen Turkish papers by Turkish authors and very good authors on typical defects in Turkish reinforced concrete construction. The president of Turkey put a tax on mobile phone use about 20 years ago, and the money was supposed to go towards retrofitting buildings that needed retrofitting against earthquakes. That really didn't happen, or didn't happen sufficiently. It is said that some of the money went towards building extra stories of buildings that were already in precarious conditions. So a social, a political, and an economic problem rather than a seismic engineering problem. Turkey has greatly improved its emergency response, although it still has work to do on that. It's improved its volunteer participation in that process. but it nevertheless is enormously vulnerable, and much of the vulnerability is concentrated in buildings that really should have been built to a far higher standard than they were. You save between 10 and 20% on the costs of a building if you don't build it to anti-seismic standards. But that is not an acceptable saving, of course, as we now know. And there was one settlement of 38,000 people very close to the epicenter of the February earthquakes, where there weren't any building collapses, and where there had been a major effort to enforce the codes. And that should tell us a very strong message.
Thank you so much, David. We have another question now from Alberto Riera. Alberto, do you want to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Evangelina. Thank you very much, Professor David Alexander. As Evangelina said, my name is Alberto Riera. I'm a civil engineer, currently doing an MSc in Risk and Disaster Science at UCL. During your talk, you mentioned that you are not very optimistic about how numerical models are really contributing to the field, mainly because they are developed by mathematicians that may not have the knowledge or the understanding about the field of risk and disaster. But I was wondering, could you elaborate a bit on that? Wouldn't you consider that maybe if there was a bit of interdisciplinary teams that could, come together and maybe even just use these models to identify what would be the better solutions for, and what you mentioned many times, where can they put their money, in the projects and so on?
Right. Well, I'm not anti-quantification at all, and there are, of course, numerical models that are extremely useful, and there always will be. But here's just one example, and it described a numerical model for optimizing search and rescue among collapsed buildings after an earthquake. When you looked at it, the optimization routine was very elegant, but it would have taken 72 hours to collect the data, which would have been a major effort following the earthquake. Now, you cannot afford, instead of rescuing people, to dedicate your time to collecting data on that. And besides, if you could only run the model after 3 days, it's too late, because the golden period is something within the 12 to 24-hour range. We also have lots of papers about optimizing the location of things like distribution centers. Well, we don't know where we're going to have damage and needs in most cases. We can know that, but it takes a huge amount of work on local microzonation and local studies of individual buildings and their likely seismic performance or likely performance in other kinds of disasters. That is enormously expensive and enormously time consuming. We have that for parts of Tokyo, but not for many other places. And if we do have it for other places, they tend to be very small places. And probably what we do have is not enough to run this kind of model. But the thing that's often ignored is situational awareness and the common operating picture. In other words, as things change, what the people who do the algorithms do is they take a disaster from the past and they apply the algorithm to it, which is all very well, but of course they have hindsight there. They have the development of the whole thing. But in the actual emergency, you don't know anything when it starts. You wonder to yourself, well, how big is this going to be? Is it going to be a minor blip, or is it going to be the great emergency of my life? That you don't know. It evolves slowly, and the picture of what is happening is only gradually compiled with much effort, which enables us then to manage what we are aware of. So it takes time for that to apply. But most of these optimization algorithms simply ignore that issue, which in a real emergency you cannot do, because that is an absolutely paramount issue. We don't have immediate knowledge of what has happened and where. It takes us time to compile that. At that point, we can start to wonder how to organize things. But until we know it, we effectively can't. That's referring to algorithms applied to the emergency phase. Now, we've probably got much more opportunity successfully to apply algorithms to other phases, particularly mitigation, and that's fine. The only thing about it is to do that effectively, it will take an awful lot of data collection, and some of that can't be done in an automated way. It's house-to-house stuff.
Thank you very much.
Do you have any more questions from people in the audience that would like to use this as an opportunity?
You can write them in the chat or the Q&A if you'd like to, which is fine by me. I'm happy to say, as I've been speaking, the wind seems to have died down somewhat. I went out this morning to buy something, and I was quite scared looking at it.
We have one more question by Putney Average.
Hello, sorry, yes, I logged in with the wrong account. My name is Anya Clarkson, so I'm a master's student on the Risk and Resilience programme at UCL, but I also work in emergency response for the UK government. And I was reflecting on what you were saying there about vulnerability and taking account of that more into plans and preparation and response. Given that vulnerability is both a very individual thing and also not static, what are your reflections on the risks of overgeneralizing versus the very practical need to make cohort level decisions during a response? Is there a balance to be struck?
I'm sure there is, absolutely. One of the areas where this is a really, really pressing question concerns disasters and people with disabilities. I've just written a big book chapter on that and had to look at it again. And really the principle of emergency planning for people with disabilities is that it has to be done for individuals. There are various other principles, one of which is if they are capable of doing it, they should be the protagonists in it. They certainly shouldn't be marginalized or have things done for them without their consent and knowledge and things like that. But anyway, now it might seem that for the harassed, overworked, underpaid emergency planner, this is an insuperable obstacle, having to write emergency plans for individual people with disabilities. In reality, there are ways that this can be done, and it is feasible and possible. The tendency is to plan for emergencies for groups of the entire population. That, of course, still has to be done. The groups may be large or small. They're usually large rather than small. How, therefore, do we manage the differences in disability and dealing with those, the different requirements of people with different disabilities, given that disability is an enormously large spectrum? Moreover, that we're dealing with a huge minority. It's worldwide reckoned to be between 16 and 17% of the population, but a recent study for the House of Commons says that in Britain, 24% of people have disabilities. Seems a rather large figure to me, but nevertheless, that's what it says. The answer is that we have to get health services, social services, the people with disabilities, the organisations that represent them, and emergency planners round the table to work out strategies for this. There are strategies. One of these is registration. I think if there is a consensus, it is that registration should not be compulsory. It should be something that the disabled and their carers can decide upon. We can then design strategies, at least for different types of disability. We can make sure that if people have to go to rest centres or alternative accommodation, that it is accessible to them, that it has things to satisfy their basic needs, that if they have, for example, working animals such as a guide dog, those are looked after and not simply banned from the place, and things like this. And in fact, I think we can achieve quite a lot, because if you look around the world, although very few countries, perhaps none, have really tackled this adequately, there are pockets of excellence. And some of those are in places where you might not expect them. For example, earthquake safety and people with disabilities in Greece. There are some really good initiatives going, top flight initiatives. There are also in Indonesia and Australia regarding disasters and disability, and various parts of the world. What we need is to make that much more universal and really to push for the idea that here there is an equity problem that must morally and ethically be tackled. It is not, in my mind, acceptable that the National Risk Register and National Resilience Framework in Britain ignore this. These are people who are genuinely and generally disadvantaged when they shouldn't be. That's in ordinary life. And the level of disadvantage soars when there is some kind of emergency or disaster. And that is just not acceptable. Neither is it necessary. It might cost money, but in fact, it is not an insuperable obstacle and it can be paid for. What it requires is organisation, commitment, especially political commitment, and involvement. And that can solve that problem. So perhaps that's a sort of model we could apply to other cases where we require rather less aggregated approach to this. I was quite impressed to look at the British Red Cross study of vulnerability. They were looking at really quite a small scale at it and looking at a whole variety of different indicators of vulnerability. And I hope that what will come out of that is that when they go to a particular place in Britain, they'll have an idea of what they need to face up to, what the problems of the place are. The tendency in Britain is to use the armed forces. Now, that's bad for various reasons. One is the armed forces have a job to do, and it's taking away from them doing that job. I mean no disrespect to them, but I think they should be allowed to do their core business. Another is that their interest, their work is not sustained in this field. They come in to do a particular job, such as sandbagging a riverbank, and then they disappear. And the third is they don't have the local knowledge. We need the local knowledge. What we therefore need is a civil protection system that is locally based. Here in Tuscany, for example, we have a tremendous problem with the elderly. That practically means me, actually, but anyway. If you go to a hospital and the accidents and emergency, it is just bung full of the elderly. People who are very old, often in their 90s, and they have to be looked after. So in point of fact, there are fairly good arrangements medically, socially, organisationally, logistically to deal with that, which means that head is above water regionally on that. And it also demonstrates it can be done. There's mass mortality in the heat wave, for example. What was the response to that? Well, the response was to start a heat wave warning system where we looked at the things that would warn us we got a problem. We looked at where people who are most at risk were likely to be. We got in contact with them. We used extensive volunteer forces for that. We had the hospitals with routines, alerts, and developed capacity for that. And therefore, next heat wave, we're in a much better position. We might not have solved the problem, but we've certainly made progress along the route to a solution.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was a very well elaborated response. Do we have someone else before we start closing this event? Ashley, do you have any other question that you want to ask?
That's everything.
Okay, so I just want to say a massive thank you, especially to David for sharing. I think I have 3 things I wrote down. The first one is it has been really inspirational, especially listening to someone who has been for so long in the field and has this strong commitment. And I think we have a lot to learn from that. And I'm very thankful for that and for sharing, for this attitude, open attitude to sharing. The second one is it leaves me with a strong sense of the responsibility that all of us have. And I think we need more, especially because of what you said. There are more and more people working in the field, but we need to take also responsibility and take a commitment in order to start changing things. So I think that that's also something that we need to embrace in our community. But the third thing is, it also like it leaves me with a sense of hope in a way, because more and more people are willing to do something, and even at a small scale in their own areas in where you live, and every small action also can make a difference. So I'm very, very inspired and also encouraged for being, while listening to all your experience and all you have been doing.
Everyone do carry on studying disasters. What they do is they open a window on the workings of society, and that's really interesting. So if you carry on studying disasters, you're bound to find it increasingly interesting, I think. I feel a bit lost here without a PowerPoint, but perhaps it's a really good thing that I didn't have one for once. And my last reflection is that I was in an emergency operations centre once, and a man came up to me. I didn't recognise him. And the reason I didn't recognise him is that he was totally covered in dust. He was wearing some kind of a uniform, but you couldn't make it out. There's so much dust on him. In fact, he just got back, quite literally just got back from a search and rescue exercise. And he said to me, you know what you taught us in class, it actually worked in the field. And I realized suddenly that he's one of the students I'd taught, and he's a fireman. That was a wonderful moment. I mean, I've had plenty of setbacks, things that have gone wrong, things that I've done that I no longer agree with, and so on. But just that one occasion when somebody said it worked was really wonderful.
Thank you so much.